There's one other thing here that I feel like is just kind of screaming for abstraction, and that is we're importing useAuth to get that user in quite a few places, and we're only using that user to authenticate our client. But I think it'd actually be even better if we could create a client that is authenticated by itself. So let's come down here, and right under our useAuth, we're going to make another function here called useClient, and this is going to get the user from useAuth. We're just going to call this same hook that's in the same file. And from that user, we're going to destructure the token. And then we want to return a function that looks like a client. We'll say endpoint and config. And we'll just return a call to the actual client with that endpoint. And we'll take the config that they give us and combine it with the token. So what we have now is effectively an authenticated client. And it would probably be a good idea to memoize this in case somebody wants to use this client in a dependency list. So we're going to use React use callback, and we'll autofill the dependencies there. Great, so now we have this use client hook we can use anywhere we need an authenticated client, which is right here in our books utils. So let's bring in use client instead of use auth. And right here, instead of use auth, we'll call use client. We'll get that client. We'll pass the client to the get book search config instead of the user. We'll accept that. And now we can get rid of that token entirely. And this client is going to be the authenticated client, which will be able to make an authenticated request with the current user. And we can do the same thing right here. We'll get our client from use client. We no longer need to pass the token because this client is now coming pre-baked with that token. We can do the same thing here. And we will pass in the client instead of the user for this get book search config. And what do you know, we do need to have that client memoized with React use callback. So it's a good thing that we did that right here already, because now it's part of the dependency list here. Great, so let's save that and come up here, and it looks like we no longer need to import the client from the API client module. And let's do the same thing over at the list items. So we'll get our client from use client. And let's grab use client from here. And for this one, we can also use client, and we no longer need the token. And down here, the same story, no longer need the token. And down here, same thing, no longer need the token. I'm pretty happy with this abstraction because it's not only simple in its implementation, but it also doesn't add any complexity to where it's actually being used, and in fact simplifies everywhere it's being used, because now none of this code needs to know how to make an authenticated request, and all of that is happening within our auth context right here. So if our authenticated request API changes slightly, we can handle that within this one module rather than having to update that in all of the other places. And this is why I love hooks so much, because it allows you to compose things together in a way that isolates concerns really effectively. So in review, what we did here is we created a use client hook that uses the use auth hook. It plucks off the user from the auth context value, which is being provided right here. And then it plucks off the token from that user, and it returns a memoized callback that calls into the client with that token to make authenticated requests. And then we updated everywhere that needs to make an authenticated request to use client instead of using the client module directly and having to pass in the user's token for each one of those, which simplified the code that makes authenticated requests and allowed us to co-locate all of the auth concerns into this one auth context module.